While I was on vacation, I was in last week. I was in Atlanta, Georgia. First time I've actually been inside the city, and it was a amazing experience for a lot of reasons. We went to a wedding of a friend of ours. I have two handball buddies and their spouses, wives from Madison, Wisconsin, and the one guy's daughter got married. She works for the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control there in Atlanta, and the weather was perfect. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I was having a conversation with a fundamentalist, which is always a lot of fun. And somehow the topic got around to same-sex marriage because, I'm from Iowa and I'm UCC, so they sort of baited me right off the bat. And they said, well, you know what Paul says about that? And I said, well, I disagree with Paul. And this person looked at me and says, you can't disagree with Paul. And I said, well, Peter did, and James and John did, and I just choose to disagree with Paul on that. And they said, well, who told you that? I said, Stan did. It was a perfect opening, one of those moments of, I'm really going to zing this one. And then I said, well, who is Stan? I got to be quoting from Scripture all the time. I said, well, Stan is somebody who disagrees with Paul. Interesting concept. I was asked recently about my assertion that faith is different than religion, and religion is even different from religious myth, which I think a lot of us are living under the concepts throughout the country of religious myth, which I think is fascinating. I had this, you probably heard, there's a church in town, I don't even know really what church it is, that's condemning Halloween. I can't even say this with a straight face. That's condemning Halloween because they said it's being led by Satan. So they're offering an alternative to the regular trick-or-treat ritual of, big-time candy, which is something that comes from Chicago. When the houses are closer together, you can get more candy per minute than you can if they're farther apart. So what I taught my kids early on about Halloween was you want to go to the neighborhoods where the houses are right next to each other. And if they're duplexes, it's even better because you can go bing, 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 right, and they said, well, what does that do? I said, it's big-time candy. Not one bag, but maybe 2 bags of candy, which is always really good for our health. But they said that Halloween is led by Satan. And so they're offering a program that if you come to their church and you offer a prayer, they'll give you a bar of candy. Now, is it just me, or is everything getting really weird now? It's not just me. It's just getting weird. It's just getting weird. The difference between religion and faith, to me, is stark. And the more religion I see, the less I like it. The more religion I encounter, the more uncomfortable I get as one who chooses and attempts to follow Jesus in the way. The more stories I hear about religious rules and regulations, the more I yearn for the freedom of Christ. As a historian, one of the examples I often give about the difference between faith and religion is this. In 1670, in New England, not far from Salem, Massachusetts, there was a minister, congregational minister, as it turns out, who was preaching from his pulpit. The elders of the community desired a parcel of land which the Pequot Indians, now you probably remember the name Pequot is the name of the ship that Ahab captained after trying to follow the Great White Whale, Moby Dick, which the Pequods owned. And so what they did is they took a box, a chest, a trunk, and they packed it full of blankets and they sent it to the Pequot Indians as a sign of friendship. The blankets happened to be infected with smallpox, which killed all 400 members of that particular Native American community. The following Sunday, the minister got up in the pulpit, this is true, quoted in history, and said, "Today we can rejoice and be glad in the Lord that we have sent 400 heathen souls to the pits of hell." That's religion. Faith is a whole different matter. Faith is where we struggle to follow Jesus. The passage I want to read this morning is something I haven't read in a long time, and it's about time I read it again. "And Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up." It was his home church, so to speak, his synagogue that he was raised in as from a young boy. "And he taught in the synagogue, being glorified by all." Hey, this is Jesus. What a nice young man he's become. He finally made something of himself. Boy, he's a good-looking man. And he speaks with such authority. And he was handed a book, and he stood up to read. And there was given to him the book of Isaiah. He opened the book, and he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And he closed the book, and he gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and all the eyes in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today, these scriptures have been fulfilled in your hearing." In other words, today is the day we begin to anoint those who walk the way, to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release and freedom to the captives, recovering of sight to those who cannot see, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable time of the Lord, and it's now. I had an amazing experience while I was gone in Atlanta. Somebody asked me as we were leaving town, they said, "Is there one thing you'd like to do before you leave?" I said, "We could set it on fire again." And they said, "We still don't mention the name of General Sherman around here." But the experience I had is that we had some time on our hands before the wedding started, a few hours. And somebody said to me, "What would you like to do here in Atlanta?" I said, "I'd like to go see the Dr. King Museum and Foundation and Center." Now, if you've never been to Atlanta, has anybody ever been there? Okay, you've been to the Dr. King's? Yep, not Dr. You've been to Atlanta, though. The center is right next door to the new Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is across the street from the old Ebenezer Baptist Church. Does anybody know what is significant about the Ebenezer Baptist Church? That's where Dr. King's grandfather and father and himself all were the ministers. This essentially is where the civil rights movement started. And if you go into the old center, which is now sort of a museum, the old Ebenezer Baptist Church, you go in there and you sit down and it looks a lot like this. A little bit older, but it looks a lot like this. And you hear the speeches and the sermons of Dr. King being played in the background. And as you listen to what's being preached, you hear the acceptable year of the Lord. You hear words about the release of the captives, of recovering sight to the blind, about freedom and dignity and human love and hope and faith. There's a museum there, and it's made up essentially of a lot of different photographs from the civil rights era, but basically one of the most important parts is there's 8 different cubicles, 4 on one side and then coming around 4 on the other. And the very first one is about segregation and lynching. As you're inside this cubicle, you see the pictures, you hear the words, you feel the experience of what it meant to be growing up and living as a black person, or as a Negro, as they said in the thing, and worse, in the South. 3 young black men hanging from an oak tree because they sassed a white woman. Because they sassed a white woman. Hanging, dead, from a tree. With a bunch of good old boys sitting around, pulling on a bottle of whiskey, smoking cigarettes, as though they had just bagged 3 deer in the woods. The sights and the sounds of that time. That went from the beginning of the century, the 20th century, to the early 1950s. And you know what struck me the most about that first cubicle? That's not that long ago. Then they went to the second cubicle, and it's all about segregation, about how people couldn't eat at the same lunch counter at Woolworths. I don't know why anybody would want to eat there to begin with. Nor do they. And how everything was separate, quote unquote, but equal. White bathroom, colored bathroom. White drinking fountain, colored drinking fountain. As late as the early 50s, Joan, my wife, who grew up in Texas, can remember white bathrooms, colored bathrooms. That's not that long ago. It progressed. The civil rights movement began to take off. There was talk of change. There was talk of equality. There was talk of human dignity. There was talk of human integrity. There was talk of being the society we have pretended to be all along, where all people are created equal, and all people have equal opportunity under the law of the nation. And then they showed the progression of the civil rights movement, people literally risking their lives to bring about what is right. Crossing the bridge into Birmingham, Alabama, non-violently being attacked by dogs, police on horses, people carrying baseball bats, watching one person go down right after another, being mowed down for what is right. Now, what is significant and why I'm bringing this up here inside the church this morning is this simple thing. The simple thing. It was all led by Christians who took the words of Jesus literally when they said, bringing sight to the blind, proclaiming liberty to the captives, giving understanding to our society, giving hope to our people, led by clergy and Christians who would not accept the status quo, which was segregation. Now, I realized at the end, and by the way, I started the first cubicle with great shame for my country. And by the time I got to the last one, I ended up with great pride in its people. And I realized, and this is my message to you and to myself this morning, I realized that the struggle continues today. It's not over. It's not over. We still have a lot of work to do in this country. You know, after Obama was elected president in 2008, people said now we're a post-racial nation. That's garbage. You're talking to someone who has children of color, who's experienced the bigotry of this country. And I'm telling you, it's still a very racist nation. They may not use the words anymore, but the practices are still there. We have a lot of work to do, and I realized that we've got to stop playing at being church and start living as disciples of the one who proclaimed liberty to the captives, who brought sight to the blind, who brought hope to the hopeless, who included people on the periphery of our society and brought them to the center and lifted them up. You know, every time I've ever heard a quote-unquote speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., I've always known that's not a speech. It's not a speech. It's a sermon. The essence of liberty, the essence of freedom. The only chance we have to be the kind of nation we say we are, and a lot of times I think it's just myth we live in, is in our hands. Because Jesus is the great liberator of the human spirit. Jesus means freedom. You know, we look at these the last Friday of the month dinners. You know, we're all worried about the economy and everything. We want to cut here and cut there, and that's okay. I don't think it's too weird to not spend what you don't have. I think that's okay. But there are needs in this country. People are hungry. People are left out. Some people don't have the medical care that we have. Some people don't have the 3 meals a day that we have. Some people don't have the mental facilities to help the healing that they are struggling with every single day. Now, I agree with both candidates of this presidential debate. This is the greatest nation in the history of the world. But if it is that, how can we allow some people to go with absolutely nothing while we're spending trillions of dollars on war? That doesn't make sense to me. And the fight that Dr. King and others, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and a host of many, many, many other people, many who do not have those kinds of names that are recognizable, what they began, we got to keep going with. We can't stop. This is our work, and I have decided this is my work. I left it somewhere. Why did I leave it? I was visibly and forcibly moved by what I saw. I want to read something, and I think this would be a great advertisement for this church if we're of the mind. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Drum Major Instinct sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, February 4th, 1968, just before he was killed. Let me read this, and I'll end it with that. Everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant. Amen.